Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming for the 7th lecture of our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I'm Professor Daniel Simon Nascimento, the organizer of this symposium and the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their financial support and the members of the research groups Pragma, Uzi, and Polyphonia for their academic support. Today, we're joined by Professor Sylvia Berryman, who is delivering our lecture. And to debate her lecture, we have Professor Lucas Angioni from Unicamp, Roberto Grasso from UFPB, and Professor Marta Jimenez from Emory University, who we hope will be able to stick with us all the way through. So let me briefly thank them all for joining us today, and without any more delay, welcome Professor Berryman to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and very kind of you to invite me, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and particularly to be presenting to an audience where there are people who, like myself, have come to Aristotle's ethics by way of study of his natural philosophy. So what I'll do first is present a basic overview of some of the ideas that I'm developing here in terms of a way of reading Aristotle's Metaethics, and then look forward to your comments and questions. So my title, Aristotle's Metaethics and Other Historical Monstrosities, really takes its departure from the secondary literature on Aristotle in really the last 50 years. It's a kind of a commonplace in the study of ethics in the Anglo-American world to talk about the idea that the work of Elizabeth Anscombe really started a kind of a revival of interest in Aristotle in contemporary ethics, not so much in history of philosophy scholarship. Okay, I'm struggling to advance my slides. Sorry, I'm fairly new to this technology. I'm gonna start again here. Sorry, I'm having trouble figuring out how to advance the slides.
I'm sorry, Sylvia, I think you have to advance it on PowerPoint as you normally do.
Yes, the thing that I did earlier to try to get it full screen was getting my way. Thank you. I think we got it now. Good. Thank you. Yeah, good. So I use this term, the Anscomian revival, rather loosely. I developed this argument in a paper that was published in Review of Metaphysics a few years ago. And it's really looking at a number of rather different texts, but drawing out some similarities between them in the way that they read Aristotle against the background of the contemporary history of ethics. So I think you can see certain similarities between at least MacIntyre, Williams, McDowell, in the way that they echo some features of Anscombe's article, Modern Moral Philosophy, which in effect started this interest in looking again at Aristotle's ethics as a program in ethical theory, and started the revival of what we now call virtue ethics. I've included Christine Korsgaard's book, The Sources of Normativity, against his list. It's somewhat different. I think what you might say that unites MacIntyre, Williams, and McDowell in their in the works that I'm mentioning here, the way that they in some ways echo the structure of Anscombe's argument, is that they're looking at the history of contemporary ethics. They're seeing some ways in which 20th century ethics is really floundering with some issues having to do with the rise of non-cognitivism or emotivism, subjectivist theories of metaethics, and is considering whether Aristotelian ethics, virtue ethics, might give us a possible alternative. What Korsgaard does a little bit different is that she presents Kant rather than Aristotle as the the figure that we should go back to. Though I think in other works she does show some sympathy to Aristotle's works and his ideas in a more developed context. But I want to look at some features of these historical narratives and the way that they position Aristotle with respect to contemporary ethical world, and try to highlight some of the assumptions that are lying behind these, because I think they tell us something important about how we should look about Aristotle. I'm going to shelve MacIntyre and go straight to Williams. His Ethics of the Limits of Philosophy talks about Aristotle's ethics as what he calls a paradigm of an approach that tries to base ethics on considerations of well-being. So Williams has this idea that Aristotle presents an alternative to non-cognitivism or subjectivism in ethics, because he's got this idea about the appeal to human nature, and what are the conditions that human nature provides for well-being. He says the question is whether it's possible to justify ethical considerations from the ground up, meaning whether you can convince a skeptic like Callicles that he ought to be moral by looking at some appeal to human nature. For Williams, he thinks that this is credible for Aristotle. Williams doesn't think it's credible today anymore. But he does present a clear reading of what he thinks Aristotle's doing, that he's appealing to human nature to provide, as it were, this Archimedean point. So this phrase Archimedean point, I think, is going to a certain kind of image. I think it should be fairly clear that he's referencing this famous saying of Archimedes, give me a place to stand and I'll move the earth. And I just want to unpack this metaphor a moment, because I think there's some really important structural issues that we want to think about. This idea of standing outside of ethics, using human nature as a kind of fulcrum in order to get some leverage against a skeptic. So the idea that human nature is something that's meant to be outside of the ethical world, so that even before you've become committed to ethics, you would share certain ideas about what human nature is like, and then you can use that to decide whether or not there's sufficient reason to buy the demands of ethics. So this idea that human nature is outside of the ethical world and it provides this kind of leverage or fulcrum for the ethicist in Aristotle's presentation is an idea I think we get from Williams. Not everybody agrees that's true of Aristotle. And here I go to McDowell in his Two Sorts of Naturalism. He's addressing both Bernard Williams and Philippa Foot. Philippa Foot, who's often taken to be very much aligned with Elizabeth Anscombe for obvious reasons. But McDowell thinks that Williams has just got the history wrong. He says, by my lights, Williams' reading is a historical monstrosity. That's where I get my title. Williams attributes to Aristotle a felt need for foundations and a concept of nature as where those foundations must be that makes sense only as a product of modern philosophy. So this is the challenge for me. It's the idea that McDowell articulates that Aristotle couldn't possibly be really even doing this sort of metaethics. He couldn't be appealing to human nature as a kind of foundation for ethics because he doesn't have the sort of problem that we have in the modern world, in this disenchanted universe, that we're concerned about where ethical ideas come from, what their foundation is. So this idea of a historical monstrosity, I rather like this particular illustration, is the challenge, the idea that taking Aristotle to be doing metaethics is completely misunderstanding the history of philosophy. In talking about metaethics here, I'm setting aside a certain movement by David Plunkett and Tristan McPherson, who's trying to narrow the scope of the term metaethics to purely non-normative questions. I'm using it in the more traditional sense, where metaethical questions include higher order questions about the source or justification of ethical demands. If you're a Plunkett and Macpherson fan, when I say metaethics, just substitute second order. Nothing really turns on the language here. I'm using the language of metaethics because it's pretty embedded in this literature. It's the one that Korsgaard uses. It's a term that McDowell will engage with. So I'm taking this from the literature rather than making any substantive claims here. So I mentioned that I'm going to talk about Korsgaard as a kind of counterpoint, because she agrees with McDowell, I think, that there's something about metaethics that really only arises in the modern scientific world. She's a little bit dubious about the historical story here, I think for good reason, so she puts it in a sort of a third person. It's often thought, though obscurely, that the normativity of ethics poses a special problem for modern moral philosophers. You can hear the Anscombe echo there. The modern scientific worldview is supposed to be somehow inimical to ethics, while the teleological metaphysics of the ancient Greek world seemed friendly to the subject. Right, so she's agreeing with McDowell that Aristotle's sort of metaethically naive. He wouldn't really ask where ethics comes from, because, you know, the teleological worldview of the ancients is permeated with value, something like that. So this idea that Aristotle looks metaethically naive to people like McDowell and Korsgaard is that he doesn't inhabit the modern disenchanted universe, which was what spurred this search for the sources of normativity. Or even more specifically, sometimes people say that if you just read the Nicomachean Ethics, it's pretty complacent and unreflective about the grounding for his view. So I'm going to take a very brief look at why I don't accept these two claims. One is simply the intellectual context, right? If you are telling the history of Aristotle's context in more detail, there are all kinds of reasons why Aristotle might not have accepted the authority of ethics, or might have raised questions about where values come from. They're not quite the same reasons that you'd have in a disenchanted universe, but we certainly do have materialists. We have skeptics, cynics, sophists. They're all asking pretty important questions about the justification for ethics. Williams thinks that's not enough. The sophists, like Callicles, don't go very deep. They're challenging a particular system of ethics in favor of another, but they're not challenging the normativity of ethics itself. And that might be true of Callicles, but it's not true of Plato. Plato, particularly if you look at the laws, is, I think, asking very deep level questions about the two worlds metaphysics, right? And I think you find all these challenges in the Sisyphus fragment, in some of the other works, and a very different kind of threat to normativity from figures like the Cyrenaics, who are doing this kind of solipsism of the present moment, who are doubting that there is any good beyond the immediate experience. Other figures in the context, including Eudoxus, Isocrates, are raising the sorts of questions that Aristotle could not have ignored. So we could talk more about this if you like, but I'm going to suggest that we shouldn't take the intellectual context to be lacking in the kind of stimulus for metaethical reflection. I like this diagram. It's actually from Long and Sedley's book, The Hellenistic Philosopher, so it's a little bit after Aristotle's time. But it reminds us just how small a world Athens is, that these figures would in fact be aware of each other's work. So while Aristotle's part of a distinct school, there are lots of philosophers in his vicinity who will be raising exactly these kinds of challenges. Well, that brings us to the Nicomachean Ethics itself, and the question that Aristotle looks kind of complacent. In order to address that, I'm going to introduce this notion of That's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to introduce this notion of what I'm calling a well-behaved text. So I think some people who are reading Aristotle's Ethics from the point of view of contemporary ethical theory have, certainly heard that Aristotle's work is a bit of a mess, and we often get sort of lecture notes rather than finished treatises, and there's some question about the provenance of the text. But there's a bit of a tendency to read it from beginning to end as though it's what I'm calling a well-behaved text. I started doing my own philosophical research in some topics in the history of the sciences where we're working on what are really not well-behaved texts where you have an author who you know something about, texts where you have arguments with a beginning, middle, and end. And I think it's fairly common in the history of philosophy to think that what we're really doing is interpreting well-behaved texts. You might think, well, okay, Plato's Republic isn't that well-behaved. It's a dialogue. There's questions about separating the views of Socrates from the views of Plato. There's a real question about the continuity between Book One and the rest of the Republic. But nonetheless, there's a sense of a beginning, middle, and end. Because I've been working so much on texts that are not well behaved, this idea that we should read the Nicomachean Ethics as a treatise with a beginning, middle, and end never really occurred to me, because I think there are considerable breaks and discontinuities within it, duplications, changes of view, some evidence of different archaeological layers. And I'm rather taken by the evidence of the ancient lists of Aristotle's books, where we don't find 10 books on ethics. We find 3 books on the good. I'd love to have that for Christmas. Stuff on friendship, 1 book on friendship, 2 books on friendship, 5 books on ethics, something on the voluntary. And if you think about the Nicomachean Ethics as a compilation, as one of several different treatises that are found in the ethical corpus, then the idea that it presents us with Aristotle's settled views and the fact that something like Metaethics doesn't seem to really feature in the Nicomachean Ethics might not be quite so compelling. There's a lot of fantastic work right now going on in scholarship on not just on the Eudemian ethics, on the Protrepticus, Magna Moralia, trying to see the evidence for Aristotle's ethical works as more of a collection of different texts rather than treating the Nicomachean Ethics as Aristotle's definitive statement. I do think that many ideas in the Nicomachean Ethics are some of Aristotle's best, but nonetheless, when you look at the amount of ink that's been spelt in trying to harmonize Book 1 with Book 10, for instance, I think this is just not the way to look at that particular text, and that we have to take seriously the possibility of breaks and development and discontinuities between the different books of the Nicomachean Ethics. When it comes to whether it represents Aristotle's view on metaethics, there's a serious thesis that had been suggested, which is that it's actually not intended as sort of graduate work, as it were. It's more, in contrast to the Eudemian Ethics in particular, it's more addressed towards adolescent audiences, perhaps, or more public presentation. So there may be reasons why the Nicomachean Ethics doesn't do as much of the sort of deeper philosophical reflection as you can see in some other parts of the corpus. You do see some hints of metaethics in the treatment of Plato's view, which are more developed in, for instance, in the Magna Moralia. So it's quite possible, if you look at the beginning of the Magna Moralia, and if you see it as Cooper suggested, and that's the view I'm inclined to, as written by somebody else, but perhaps reflecting an earlier strata of Aristotle's own thought. There is a suggestion, actually, that there was something like a book one where he's dealing with other views, rival views, in the way that you might expect if you were taking the structure of, say, the physics or the De Anima and looking for Aristotle's systematic refutation of other philosophers as a starting point. Those are some textual notes. We can take those up if anybody's interested, but they're the reasons why I don't take either the intellectual context or the particulars of the Nicomachean Ethics as evidence that Aristotle wouldn't be metaethically reflective. So maybe if he is metaethically reflective, is Bernard Williams right that he's appealing to human nature? I'm going to invent a term, Archimedean naturalism, here, because naturalism is said in many ways, particularly in contemporary ethics. And I want to particularly look at the kind of appeal to human nature that Williams thinks Aristotle makes. He says that human nature serves as an Archimedean point. And here I take it to be providing substantive ethical advice from outside of the normative domain. That's the idea of standing outside of the world. And it's a position that avoids making ethics subjective, but in Williams' view is no longer credible today. So this notion of Archimedean naturalism, this is a view I'm going to interrogate. It's not one I accept myself. It's the idea that Aristotle is looking at human nature to provide substantive advice and the justification for accepting demands, and that the notion of nature is one that's accessible more or less from outside the ethical domain. So if we take that as a question, two research questions: is Aristotle metaethically self-aware? And is Aristotle an Archimedean naturalist? We get this four-part table, if you like. Williams thinks that Aristotle does appeal to nature and that he is metaethically aware. Korsgaard and McDowell doubt that he's metaethically aware. Korsgaard takes him as appealing to human nature. McDowell does not. So 3 of the 4 squares there of my table are occupied by well-known and prominent figures. We know, of course, that Aristotle does a lot of work on biology and does have a very developed notion of human nature. And this is partly why Williams' thesis was so attractive. It has, I think, got a fair amount of uptake in, perhaps in the more popular reading of Aristotle's appeal to virtue ethics. He certainly began investigating the natures of biological species, including human beings. He has a notion of a more or less scientific perspective. I agree that there are some elements of value in his science all the way down, but you can still distinguish a perspective that enables us to understand human beings and derive substantive ethical conclusions from the kind of being that we are. Well, so we can ask, was he an Archimedean ethical naturalist? So to go back to my table, my answer is pretty clear. I'm saying he's not. I'm putting myself in the 4th box, the one that hasn't been occupied yet, where I'm claiming that, yes, he is ethically self-aware, but he's not appealing to human nature to provide the foundations for ethics. So here's a few considerations against a naturalist reading. And here's the irony here. I mentioned that McDowell doubts that Aristotle is metaethically self-aware. But oddly, McDowell draws a lot of arguments from Aristotle himself. And in the 2 Sorts of Naturalism, he gives you a number of reasons for doubting that Aristotle is a naturalist that seem to me to be exactly the kind of arguments that would support my position. One is the sui generis nature of practical reason. Uniqueness isn't quite the right word there. It's different than theoretical reason. And that suggests that when we're reasoning practically, we're not appealing to nature. The virtues are valued for themselves. They are not, in effect, ways to help us further the goals of human nature. So take courage. If the argument were that we need to be courageous because it helps us defend the human community, it supports the community as a whole, Aristotle's argument would have gone rather differently. In fact, he recognizes that, for instance, the Spartans, who are trained in a certain kind of boldness, are probably better fighters than the Athenians. But he doesn't think they have true courage because they don't, in effect, do what he thinks that the truly courageous person does. They may be more effective at defending the goals of human nature's survival, but they may be not qualifying as truly courageous because they're not doing it as the courageous person should. This notion that the virtues are intrinsically valuable, that we pursue them because they're fine, not because they're good for us. That's a real reason for thinking that Aristotle isn't taking human nature to play this kind of justificatory role. And then, as McDowell also argues, if you took human nature as being this sort of blueprint for giving us substantive ethical advice, there's pretty limited evidence of that substantive appeal in the ethics. There is a good bit of it in Book 1 of the Politics. So I think if Aristotle had been appealing to human nature, he'd have written his ethics in a way that would look a lot like Book 1 of the Politics there. Right, he's justifying slavery, the subordination of women. These are substantive ethical commitments, the priority of the polis, on the grounds of the appeal to human nature. So if that's what he was doing in the ethics, I'd be worried, because this looks like clear evidence of Archimedean ethical naturalism on Aristotle's part. I think you only see it in Book 1 of the Politics, not in the rest of the work. And I think there are ways in which nature, as it's understood in the Politics, is really out of step with the biological notion of nature. It's something more like the sophistic notion, where it's really more like legitimacy. Natural is opposed to the purely conventional, right? So the people who are like Callicles or Thrasymachus, who are arguing that justice is the interest of the stronger, they're denying that has a nature, that there's anything natural about justice. That's a sort of appeal where you've got this binary notion here between the natural and the conventional. That's the sense in which Aristotle, in Book 1 of the Politics, is arguing that the city, that holding slaves is natural. He's saying it's justified. It's not a biological appeal. There's a lot of messiness in looking at the details of the kind of claims that Aristotle makes in Book 1 of the Politics. And it's not what he does in the rest of the book. When he's looking in Book 2 at the details of constitutions, the appeal to human nature makes very, very, very little appearance. He's arguing dialectically. He's arguing in the way that you'd expect if you read his ethics, that he's talking about what we value, what we take to be consistent, all kinds of different considerations. He's not saying this is natural. So I actually think that Book 1 of the Politics should be put in brackets. It's a tricky argument to make, to depend on developmentalism. But I think when you look carefully at the notion of nature, it doesn't suggest to us that he's appealing to biology here. Julian has made some such view of this sort in The Morality of Happiness as a more general claim. She wasn't really being specific about the politics here, but she says, look, his view of nature is teleological, but this plainly gives us no reason to think that we can sensibly ask what whole species are for or what the point of their lives is. Aristotle doesn't have a universal teleology, and the teleology that he does have is not a theory about human lives. I think that's right. I agree with her, despite the evidence of Politics 1. if you look at the Nicomachean Ethics, there are a few things, the function argument, that you have to look at a little bit carefully, because they have given some sort of support to the notion that he's appealing to human nature to settle some questions, but I don't think it's the primary mode of argument. So I think that the appeal to human nature is certainly there. I think virtually anybody has to recognize, any ethicist is going to recognize that there are certain facts about ourselves that are going to set certain kinds of constraints. Any ethical system's got to feed the kids and, you know, do all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't really settle the substantive questions for us. If you look at the function argument, it notoriously doesn't settle how we should live. There are all kinds of ways to use our reason, and nobody's really, there isn't a consensus on what Aristotle means by that, whether he means ivory tower speculation or practical reason. The debate still rages. I'm not going to enter into that one myself unless anybody pushes me on that, but I think ethical virtues in Aristotle are valued for themselves, and they're not meant to further biological goals. He does really mean what he says about the fine, and that he is in effect closer to what would be called constructivism today in his ethics, in his metaethics. Them's fighting words. I think I might be the first person to actually claim that Aristotle is a constructivist. And one reason why you might not think he is that he doesn't share a modern view where we have to ask where ethics comes from because of the worldview that we have, right? So if Aristotle doesn't share our worldview, where we sort of came from out of a sort of more natural origins, why would he ask where ethics comes from? Well, I think his picture of the sciences gives rise to those sorts of questions. It's this idea that you see the ethics as part of this nested structure, where in the physics we talked about things which have natures. On the soul, we talked about living things. On the motion of animals, we talked about animals, self-movers. And then on the basis of that superstructure, we then add the ethics, which is talking about a particular kind of self-mover, the human kind, the one that makes choices about our own actions. So I think the contrast between animal self-motion and human action is a starting point of the ethics. And that does give rise to a question about where the practical good comes from, because animals are not making choices, animals and small children. So this idea about where does the practical good come from is a question that gets posed by the structure of Aristotle's own ethics, as you read it against the background of his larger project. And I take some particular, one of the inspirations for my constructivist reading of Aristotle is the centrality of this notion of agency to normativity. So I'm particularly interested in the fact that of the four major ethical normative treatises, Nicomachean Ethics, Eudemian, the Politics, and Magna Moralia, which I do take to be evidential, three of the four of them virtually begin with the same sentence. I say virtually, it's actually a chapter in the Magna Moralia, but as I said, I think the Magna Moralia at the beginning is showing us evidence of this sort of book one style, in the style of the physics, where he's actually refuting his predecessors, and then we get to the start of the substantive account a little bit into the Magna Moralia. And they start with something that's remarkably similar. In the Nicomachean Ethics, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. In the Politics, every community is established with a view to some good. Everyone who acts in order to obtain that which they think good. So this notion about action being aiming at the good, what David Berryman calls the Guise of the good, is, I think, very central to the claim here. And slightly more garbled version in the Magna Morale. As I said, I believe, Cooper, that it's written down by a student and doesn't actually very closely mirror Aristotle's own language. But first of all, we must see that every science and capacity has an end, and that too a good one. For no science or capacity exists for the sake of evil. There's something similar in the Eudemian ethics, but it's actually a little bit different. It's actually making what I think to be a more empirical claim. I haven't got a completely good story about why the Eudemian ethics might depart from the structure of these other three claims. But I'm going to start with this notion that every action aims at some good. I'll take that to be, I'm taking that out of the details of the actual formulation in the Nicomachean Ethics for the moment, and just look at the fact that there are two possible readings of this term. One is a substantive claim and one is a formal claim. People like Berryman have made fun of the notion that it's a substantive claim, or trying to show that it's actually false as a substantive claim. They don't think that the formal claim is very interesting because it's tautological. I think the opposite. I think it's not a substantive claim in Aristotle, and it is a formal claim, and that the formal claim, even though tautological, is informative. So let me try to say a little bit about that. So I think as a substantive claim, it would be something like an empirical or psychological claim that people always do what they think is best. That may have been Socrates' view. Socrates might just be one of these peculiar individuals who think that, if you could cut through all of the misinformation and the false beliefs, you actually find out that everybody really is trying to be good. I think that both Plato and Aristotle thought that this isn't always true, that they go to a lot of work to try to explain why we sometimes do not what we think is the best. But I think there's still an interesting notion behind a different reading of that claim. So if you're spending a lot of time thinking about Socrates' claim, you might notice that you could read it two ways. You could either think that it is an empirical claim, or you could think that it's a formal notion. This is a definition, if you like, of action. Think about animal self-motion. It's pursuit and avoidance. When you're avoiding something, you're taking it to be an object of negative valence, if you like, something to be distanced from. If you're pursuing something, you're taking it to be a practical goal, if you like. You're introducing a new notion here of a practical good by virtue of the fact of pursuit. If you didn't have animals, creatures who are pursuing and avoiding, you wouldn't have a world with that kind of practical good in it. You would have a natural world which may have its own goals, but you don't have these particular practical goods until you have beings who are making choices, who are pursuing and avoiding certain kinds of things. So it's actually a formal claim. This is what action is. It's aiming at some good. Action, again, goes beyond animal self-motion. It's into the human realm. And I think it's where the action is being conceived as good, that you have something that's specifically human, that distinguishes us from animal action. So I think it's inherent in the nature of action to pursue some goal that's positively valenced. And that is a substantive claim, informative, even though it's tautological. There are things, maybe ticks or twitches, that are at the margins. They don't count as actions because they're not aiming at some good. And that's where I think Aristotle takes as his point of departure. And I think it's very interesting that he begins all of the normative treatises with this new fact about human animals. Unlike other self-movers, they are capable of action, they are aiming at some good. Elizabeth Anscombe famously thought that there is a scope fallacy in the first line of the Nicomachean Ethics. A lot of people try to show why there isn't. I think there's another ambiguity there, right? And if you look at the relationship between the first and the second part of the sentence, even once we've got the idea that it's a formal notion on board, there's another issue here, which is the difference between some good and the good. Every action, every inquiry, here I'm going to the actual text, not simply this formulaic version of it. Every action and every inquiry, and similarly, every art and every inquiry, and similarly, every action and choice is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has been well said to be that at which all pursuits aim. A couple of points about the translation I'm using here. One is that Anscombe thought that it was a false inference. That's why I'm translating Kalos very carefully here, as it's been well said. He's approving this inference. He's not saying that it logically follows. So I don't think that there's a scope fallacy or logical fallacy. I think there's an inference, but it's one that he takes to be a good one. And that at which all things aim is the usual translation in English. I've take the panta there to be ranging over the 4 items named above, the art, the inquiry, the action and choice, and I've given them the label pursuits. I don't think he's talking about everything. He's talking about practical, specifically practical things here. So I'm tweaking the commonly used translation here to read pursuits. Yeah, so talk about the relationship between some good and the good. Anscombe thought it was the difference between the plural and the singular, and thought that there's a mistake moving from one of many goods to a good ranging over all things. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's the difference between pro tanto and genuine here. That's the some and the is picking out. Here's the idea, right? That every action, tautologically, is aiming at some apparent good. There's got to be some way in which you're seeing this as pursuit worthy in order to be pursuing it. In order to count as pursuing it. But then there's a further thing, the further inference that Aristotle's approving, which is the idea that there would be a good at which we would aim all pursuits. And that's the genuine good, I think. So he's making a substantive philosophical point here in the move from some to thee, and it's not a tautology. It's saying that he's agreeing with the inference that it's because we aim at some good that we take there to be the good, which is the ultimate aim of every action. And that's in fact what he wants to convince us in the Nicomachean Ethics, that there is a notion of eudaimonia that we can articulate and which is the goal of all actions. So while there has been a lot of discussion of this first sentence, I'm actually proposing a rather different reading of the ambiguities in it. And I'm calling this notion Socratic bootstrapping. It's not because it's Socrates. Socrates, I think, had a rather different view, but it's because Aristotle got it by reflecting on Socrates' paradox. And it is a way of bootstrapping practical normativity. Here's the idea, right, that the ability to distinguish between what seems good and what is good means that we are implicitly, he thinks, committed to reflecting as rational being, practically rational beings, on what really is good. We have the capacity for action, and we aim at some good, but because we have this notion of what is really good, we can always ask ourselves, are we pursuing what's really good? And it would be practically irrational not to reflect on that. So this notion that there's this commitment, implicit commitment to normativity built into the very fact of acting, that I think is compressed into that first claim. And that's what I'm calling Socratic bootstrapping. The notion of the true practical good arises with the existence of rational choice. You might like a bit more text than just that one sentence. I'll show you a few things where I think Aristotle is clearly distinguishing the practical good from the natural good. Eudaimonia Ethics 1.8, he says, what is good as many senses? Some are achievable by action, some not. The kind that's achievable by action is not found amongst unchanging things, unlike Plato, right? So this idea that, or even the goods of species, species forms. So this idea that whatever we're doing when we're pursuing the practical good, we're doing something different than we're doing when we're thinking about the natural good. Magna Moralia, I think, makes the same claim. The object of desire or intellect first initiates movement. It's not every object of intellect that does it, but only the one in the domain of action. It's goods of this sort that initiate movement, not everything fine. So only some kinds of goods are practical goods. I'm particularly fascinated by Eudaimonia Ethics 2.6, and there's a passage where he talks about the sense in which human beings are an arche of their action. A lot of people have taken this to be efficient cause of action, and I argue it's not. It's actually final cause. It has to be final cause. And the idea is that, yeah, we're the archi of the goal that we're pursuing. We, and not nature, not God, are the source of the practical good. These are all texts we could talk about. None of them are quite as clear as I would like, but I think they're together, they add up to a fair amount of evidence that we can take another look at Aristotle against the background of this idea of ethical constructivism. A view that's been articulated in the sort of the post-Rawlsian world, and there are proceduralist and constitutivist versions, and I think Aristotle's version is constitutivist. It's constitutive of the notion of action, that we aim at the good. It doesn't deny the intersubjective validity of its claims. So this is a nice thing about a constructivist view. It doesn't take normativity to be built into the natural world. It is part of the human world of action and choice, thought and activity, but nonetheless it achieves intersubjective validity. So I think this is a place to look for the reconstruction of Aristotle's metaethics. I want to confess to being a little bit worried about what I'm going to call the hammer fallacy, right? If you just got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Just because constructivism has been articulated recently, am I just going and looking for it in Aristotle? Because you can find pretty much anything in Aristotle somewhere, right? And, you know, this kind of warning case study, if you like, would be Putnam and Nussbaum's attempts in the 80s to find functionalism in Aristotle. It had just been articulated in contemporary philosophy of mind. They found it in Aristotle. And, you know, that's always a worry. I think there is a possibility of finding constructivism avant la lettre, if you like. Paul Katsafanas has recently argued, I think even better evidence than mine, for finding constructivism in Nietzsche. And that's certainly before the articulation by Rawls and company. But I'm also interested in a really not very well studied, or a text by Paul Guise that has sort of fallen off the radar a little bit, The Conception of Value, where he makes an argument that is very close to the sort of reasoning I think you do find in Aristotle. He doesn't present it as Aristotle's own, but he presents it as a sort of an Aristotelian idea, where you're thinking about the world as constructed in stages, and thinking about what a difference it makes when you introduce organisms into the natural world, and you've got this notion of the natural good. It's a kind of a new metaphysical stage. He calls it metaphysical transubstantiation. And he claims that there's a similar kind of transubstantiation that happens with the introduction of practical reasoners. And that's exactly how I think about Aristotle in terms of these nested stages with these new notions of the good, two of them introduced at different stages. So there's certainly some sort of precedent for thinking in Aristotelian terms. There are people, Korsgaard is one of them, interestingly, Marc Lebar, who's developed what he calls an Aristotelian constructivism, though he doesn't think it's actually Aristotle's. His is a little different than the way I would read Aristotle. But there's certainly people who have seen resources for constructivism, for practical agency in Aristotle. And for good reason. I think that's because that's a reflection of what's really going on there. So just to sum up, I think there are reasons to consider Aristotle's better ethical reasoning. There's plenty in his historical context that would spur him to examine the sources of normativity. I don't think we should take gaps in the Nicomachean Ethics as an argument from silence. He is critical of his predecessors, and that does involve metaethical reflection. And I don't think he's constitutionally complacent when it comes to ethics. There is much to be regretted in his ethics, but he may have some character flaws. But I don't think he's ever stops thinking about these questions. The apparent naturalism of the book one, of Politics Book 1 is, I think, an anomaly. There's little evidence of a substantive appeal to nature in the ethical writings, despite the function argument. There is an explicit distinction between natural dispositions and true virtues, which suggests that he's not looking at something that happens by nature. And this notion of practical rationality, which makes a critical difference. So I think these are all reasons to doubt that Aristotle is an Archimedean ethical naturalist, as Williams thought. Does that make him a constructivist? Well, here's some reasons. The centrality of the claim that action inherently aims at some good. The nested picture of the sciences, which introduces normativity along with the human capacity for deliberation and for choice and action. And these texts that distinguish the natural and the practical good. So those are my positive reasons for presenting you with a historical monstrosity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for the wonderful presentation. We have a few questions from the debaters before we move to the audience. I'll start with Marta. Marta is the first one. Please, Marta, your question.
Yeah, I have a little, I would like to start with a clarificatory question, because it seems to me that a lot of what you're saying is compatible with McDowell's view. And I don't like you put yourself in this square, establishing a difference with his view. And I wanted just for you to just clarify a little bit first before I ask my question about what you take the main difference to be.
Good. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I explicitly borrow from McDowell. It's not just compatible. I think he's great. He's a wonderful reader of Aristotle, but he's got this Kantian history of philosophy where he thinks we're just in a different world. And therefore, the kind of metaethical stuff that is going on in this post-Kantian world couldn't be true for Aristotle. I just say, well, look at the context of Aristotle. There's other reasons. It's not Kant's reasons. Aristotle isn't in a disenchanted universe, okay. But there are people who are, to some extent, at least the atomists, And then there are also these other spurs. So there's, this people asking questions about the sources of ethics. People like the Cyrenaics, who I think are probably pretty important for Aristotle's attempt to argue that there is a good that's beyond our experience. The challenge coming from certain views about pleasure. So yeah, I think McDowell's right in resisting the naturalism. That's what I borrow from him. But in thinking, he's in very shaky interpretive grounds or hermeneutical grounds in thinking that Aristotle couldn't possibly be metaethically reflective because he gets so much from Aristotle. And if he reads Aristotle as being so smart and so subtle as he does, I think rightly, he might want to give Aristotle a little bit more credit. So I think, as I read McDowell, it's the Kantianism, the Kantianism history that is getting in the way, and that there are other ways to access metaethical reflection. Yeah?
Yeah, so maybe a connected question that is also clarificatory is there is this rejection of the fact that Aristotle has an Archimedean ethical naturalism, but you do want to preserve a certain kind of naturalism. That's, I think, that is kind of, or not. Is that is there a space for naturalism, or the kind of constructivism that you attribute into him leaves out like the notion of naturalism altogether, like any kind of naturalism altogether?
Right, yeah. I mean, Aristotle isn't the Stoics. He isn't as revisionary of, that's kind of an extreme view, right? So most ethicists aren't quite that revisionary, and they do grant, look, human nature is going to set some constraints. You can't be happy on the rack. You do need a certain amount of just sort of ordinary stuff. But I don't count that as naturalism. It's stage setting. It gives you some kind of criteria that need to be there. But when we're trying to think about which is the good life, is it the life of theoretical reasoning or the life of practical reasoning? Aristotle doesn't answer that, notoriously, right? You can't tell from just reading the text. These are still questions that we need to sort out in the space of practical reasoning. So I think it's the fact that we go to the space of practical reasoning, not to appealing to human nature, to settle the really interesting stuff. Yeah, there's some constraints. He's got a sort of sense of the practical world in which, yeah, you've got to be realistic about what goods you're going to achieve. And some of them are going to come from human nature. You still endorse them. But it's like rational endorsement, right? Rational endorsement means that the decision isn't made by the source, it's made by the justifier. So the fact that you might decide to endorse constraints that come from your own biological nature, it's you that's doing the endorsing. You're not looking to nature with a telescope the way Galileo was doing in that sort of Archimedean picture. You're endorsing something that you take to be ethically valuable. And it's you who's making that decision there. So I think he's left behind Archimedean naturalism, even though occasionally human nature might make the odd appearance. It's not definitive, it's not decisive, it's not settling the question. We're settling the question.
Yeah. So I think I was wondering whether there's a space for something intermediate, and I haven't thought a lot about this, so it might be just an aberration of a proposal, but something that is between just and I think that this acknowledging of the fact that human nature sets some limits is kind of the beginning of some sort of naturalism. That I thought it was the kind of second sort of naturalism that McDowell was leaning towards in his two kinds of naturalism. So it is not so much that there is this kind of form of human nature that determines how our decisions about what is good for us and what to do is in a full way. However, there is some kind of form of a human life that is going to just set, on the one hand, set some limits, and also kind of give us some goals towards which this is kind of what it is to be some the good options about what it is to be a good human, and they are not, they're loosey goosey, as it's what a virtue is, what it could to be courageous or to be generous, and there is there is this kind of like forms that there's not a recipe about how to achieve them, but nonetheless, despite the fact that there is a flexibility, there is something about what it is to be a good specimen or what it is to be human that is going to include these things. And insofar that if that is the case, then it seems that it's kind of like an intermediate between like full-on naturalism and like full-on constructivism, but something that is kind of like there is something, even if it is not fully determined. And in relation to that, it might be that like the doctrine of the mean might help to us to like see how that is, like how to work that out, because like the idea that the mean is relative to us kind of is the thing that introduces that flexibility. So it introduces the possibility of reason being practical in the sense that it's like relative to the situation and relative to us, and yet there is nonetheless kind of like some kind of like cloudy goal that is related to what it is to be a good specimen of a human.
Yes.
And that I think to be intermediate between the extreme Archimedean, or like the extreme even just like there's a form of human nature that is determined, and the kind of like a none of that has any role.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think constructivism is the intermediate already, right? Between it's between the idea that you're discovering and inventing. And here's the thing, right? So yeah, of course, it's anytime you've got two positions and there's some concession to one, you think, well, there's a bit of a compromise. But the question is, what's doing the sorting? And this goes back to the question about rational endorsement, right? So I think it comes out best for me in some exchanges between Julianus and Rosalind Hursthouse, who's influenced by the sort of Foot way of looking at ethics as a contemporary ethical program. She's not doing Aristotle scholarship. And it goes something like this. Well, okay, you want to do virtue ethics. You want to look at human nature. Human nature, from our contemporary perspective, right, it doesn't look very nice. What if it turns out that, anthropology tells us we're all sexist, homophobic, whatever, are we going to be okay with that? Or are we going to decide, well, okay, we're still going to have kids, but we might decide to rethink some of the gender politics? And if you decide that you're going to make that decision for yourself, then you're an Urathian, you're not a foundationalist. You're taking, there's some material there, but you're deciding which bits to keep. And that's what matters, right? You're not just taking things from nature because it's natural. You're picking what you think works, and you're making those determinations. So we're in the realm of the space of practical reasoning. We're no longer in the realm of letting nature call the shots. So that's why I think it's not quite symmetrical, right? You don't just combine them. It's about what level the decision making is happening.
Good. So, but this is not an objection. This is just like I'm trying to just like get the different. It might be an objection, but by accident. So it is a. The question then is like you mentioned the Urathian way of thinking, but that like McDowell is completely on board with that being attributed to Aristotle's practical thinking. So like in that sense, the kind of naturalism that he's attributing to Aristotle is compatible with that Urathian way of thinking, and yet he still keeps the naturalism part.
Yeah, well, he doesn't do the naturalism. You're right. He thinks Aristotle's Urathian. What he doesn't do is think Aristotle's reflective about it, metaethically reflective. And again, I think I'm not a McDowell scholar. I hope I'm not misinterpreting him, but my sense is that his position is a little historically odd, interpretively odd, because he's getting so much from Aristotle as a contemporary, reflective, metaethically aware scholar and a fantastic reader of Aristotle. But he doesn't think that Aristotle is seeing. He's doing it deliberately. I think Aristotle is. I think it's not an accident that you get so much good stuff there. So, I love McDowell as a reader of Aristotle. I think he is, as you say, Urathian in his reading of it. But he must think Aristotle I don't know how he thinks Aristotle got it right.
Yeah. Okay. So it is the way in which I was understanding it, but I need to rethink it. And again, I also am not a McDowell scholar, so I don't know. But I thought that he was like kind of attributing to him this other way of being a naturalist that is compatible with being like with having that kind of like Neurathian way of thinking, and that has and is related to the fact like despite that there is no blueprint or there is like nature is doing some work. So it's just like for example, when he talks into kinds of naturalism, I was just like looking quickly because I read it a long time ago, but like he talks about if wolves had reason, then there will be this thing about how the first thing that they when they are deciding what to do, one of the things or the main thing that interesting conversation is what wolves need. That doesn't mean that they are determined by that kind of necessity in order to just act. Nonetheless, in the reasonings about what to do, what wolves need figures as kind of very important. And of course, then there is this kind of the constructivism comes in there are going to be divergences of thinking about what wolves need in itself. So that the same way that we think about human nature as a limit, as well, there's going to be disagreements about what human nature is. And there's some people who say that we are cooperative, and there's some people who say that we are competitive and aggressive. And it depends on there's a number about there's going to be disagreement, and yet kind of assumptions about that are going to play a role in how we think about it.
Right.
Maybe that's what you're calling constructivism, but to me, some kind of intermediate version that has some kind of aspirations to be naturalist, in the sense that they have an eye looking at what the sciences are doing in that regard, and how we think about human nature in order to make decisions about what is good for us to do.
This is the problem with the word naturalism, is it gets pretty fuzzy. What McDowell does do is what he calls second nature, but he means reason. And as far as I'm concerned, by the time you're yes, of course, reason is part of human nature, but it's a question, is it Archimedean? Can you stand outside and look at what it is, or do you have to be doing it? Are you in the space of reasons? You're in the space of reasons. Why call it naturalism? I mean, I'm not going to fight about terms if someone, but you got to, it's not Archimedean naturalism for sure.
Yeah.
And I happen to think it's pretty close to constructivism if you look at the way you get there. What you're doing when you start reasoning. You're not appealing necessarily to human nature, right? It's the idea that you have to start again with this notion of the practical good. And that practical good isn't coming from human nature. It's coming from the structure of action. And the fact that Aristotle lays that out so carefully at the beginning of 3 of the 4 treatises, it's slightly different form in the Eudemian ethics. And it speaks to where that fits. How is he starting ethics? He's not saying, where do you start? What's the first move? Let's think about what action is. It's aiming at the good. Let's talk about that, right? Where did that come from? Well, it came from the fact that actions are goal-directed. And therefore, if we've got some goals, we can talk about what the right goal is. That's where our reflection starts. And that's what I think is really interesting about Aristotle's ethics. And that's kind of been missed, I think. People took the first sentence to be interesting for Anscombe's reasons, but I think there's a whole lot more going on there. And the fact that it links us from the motion of animals to the ethical space, I think is absolutely fascinating, because it's a great place to start. Yeah. And the fact that other people today are looking at the way that, trying to articulate, as Berryman and Korsgaard did in different ways, the idea that it's somehow constitutive of practical agency to be seeking normativity or to be normative. That's a really subtle and interesting thing. I think you get that in Aristotle himself. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that Daniel is next. See you.
So yeah, I'm next. I have a few questions. I will apologize for not if my questions are not straight to your theme. I'm still reading your book, and I'm just beginning to reflect on a lot of the things that you write there. So I think there are two questions, maybe three. I will start with something that I think is a little more related, which is, as I was reading your book and following your presentation, I was not particularly reminded of the authors you quote, because I don't really know them that well, except for Kosgard, maybe. But I was reminded of David Wong's works on relativism. I'm not sure if you, yeah. I thought that was so close, the kind of reading you're proposing from Aristotle is so close to what he writes, and I love his vision. I think it's very interesting, and I wonder if you think that too, if you think they end up being similar in the end.
Yes, yeah, I got David Wong comes in the end. I think he's fabulous, and yeah, I really liked his stuff. I've only read a couple of pieces of his, but I think I do mention some ideas that he contributes to the constructivist debate in the end. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, then I missed that. Because the thing for me is, like, he's a relativist. He believes there are different moralities, but he believes that nature constrains what can count as moral behavior, right? So there is that idea. Human nature somehow sets the stage. And he stresses that there are better and worse moralities. So I'm reminded of Aristotle's idea that, for instance, you got different kinds of political regime for different kinds of people. And then there's the real question I would like to ask you is this. I think that the whole constructivist thing about morality and about ethics, I think it works a lot when you're talking about the virtue of justice. But I wonder if it works just as well for all the other virtues and the way Aristotle conceived them. Because when you think about Sophrosine, for instance, temperance, which is the meaning related to bodily pleasures, I mean, would he concede that this could be, this could vary, and not just because people have a different bodily constitution, but culturally vary? You understand? And so with little other virtues too, like courage, for instance. I wonder if he is willing to go back a little on that. So if you like to talk about that first, then I would ask another question about courage.
Great. No, that's a really deep question, getting into what Aristotle thinks about cultural variation and cultural development. And I'm really taken by the kind of reasoning he does in Politics Book 2. And I'd like to spend a bit more time on that. He does recognize in the Politics the fact that his own culture has changed on its own values and gotten better on certain kinds of things. So I think you can extrapolate from that the possibility that we could still, room for improvement. I think he thinks that there's certain kinds of minimal qualities. You can't come in as a cyclops, you're not going to be a very good neighbor. But there's certainly different regimes and different experiments among the different cities, and he does seem a bit sort of, at least in the Politics, a bit pragmatic, open-minded about some of those, trying to see, what maybe there's room for variation in particular contexts or for particular needs. So, yeah, does he think he's got that Athens of his day has the definitive view? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think he thinks that there's certain sorts of virtues that are gonna work better and have a better track record in terms of forming human societies. But yeah, I'm still thinking through how open-minded he could be about the possibility that his own view might be less than perfect. So I've been interested by this complacency problem, and why people see him as complacent, and what there is about his attitude towards the possibility of cultural variation there. I don't think he's a relativist, but I do think he thinks that you reason in a context and you reason with particular facts. You don't reason in a sort of Platonic heaven when you're doing ethics. So yeah, that's getting to the sort of things I'm concerned about and interested in. Yeah.
So, speaking of Platonic heaven, you use the expression "happy on the rack," which I mean I really played it for a while, and the Glaucus challenge is like my favorite passage in the whole of philosophy. I keep reading that, and I keep not understanding it. So here's my question for you. I don't know if you agree with me on this, but the first thing that popped to my eye when I started reading the Nicomachean Ethics is that Aristotle he never taught your ear off about how you should prefer to die instead of making any vicious action. He doesn't.
Yes.
I mean, if you keep looking, if you keep searching for it, maybe you can find that as an implication of something else he's saying. But he's not at all following Socrates, Plato on that trail, you know. But I've been reading the Nicomachean Ethics on courage of a student, and it's amazing how ambivalent he is there about whether or not, you know, and it's not even about the rack, it's about dying.
Yeah.
The big problem for Darwinism, right? I mean, if the goal is to be happy, it seems like you have to be alive to be happy. So to choose to die, you know. So what I was interested in asking you is, do you agree with that? Do you think that he holds that in the end, that he follows Socrates down that path?
I think that, the really great question. I think one of the closest things maybe speaks to that is a business about friendship, about choosing the best for your friend. And, you know, if you're choosing which of you is going to die, it might seem that the best choice there is to die honorably. But it's not the choosing to die, it's the choosing the honor, right? So I think he might allow you that. But I think you're right. He certainly isn't pushing that extreme revisionist angle. He does think luck is necessary, right? That there are situations that are simply to be pitied. So I think I'm with you there. It's
okay. I would take a look at that passage from the friend, but I don't know, from friendship, but I would. Right now, I would tend to try to explain that, saying, okay, there might be some very few friends who are very, very valuable to you. You know, your closest friends, the ones who are at stake at Nicomachean Ethics 3:1 when the tyrant gathers kidnaps your people and forces you to do something awful. Maybe for them, but I mean, because for Aristotle, if you take seriously his theory of friendship, everybody in any community counts as a friend. So. Yes. There are people you really don't care about that much, and I think he would allow that too. So, well, so you're not under the impression that for him too you gotta choose death. I think that calms me down a little bit, because I would be very hard pressed to find any grounds for that opinion in Aristotle's philosophy. You know,
I think it's choosing honor. Choosing honor, he would say, yes, that's the good, that's the fine, and that may sometimes require death.
Yeah, but from the daimonistic point of view, that's my point. Why should you choose honor?
Because it's the fine, it's the good.
Yeah, but if you stay alive, can't you make it up by doing other fine and honorable actions? I mean, in the end, okay.
I don't think so in that context. If you betray your city, I don't think you're living the Eudaimon life. I do think he's going to be pretty conventional on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the last question, which I thought, because of Martha's question about the mean, I think the mean is really an interesting thing for us to look at when we talk about nature, because I don't know who said that on an article. Like, people were complaining that the doctrine of the mean was empty and it said nothing. And I don't remember who said that, but I thought it was a very good point. I said, no, it's not. It's not meaningless. To say that you got to look for the mean is actually a very substantial advice, because it's the mean between pleasure and pain. So what could be obvious is look for the most pleasure you can look. And he's telling you, don't do that. Your nature is such that, it's going to turn out badly, So look for the mean. But at the same time, that's what Marta was pointing out. Yeah, it's the mean relative to you. So there is a lot of room for adjusting. Anyway, I think that.
Yeah. No, I think Owen kind of argues, look, having a doctrine of the mean means you don't have a doctrine of extremes. You're not being a Stoic, for instance. And so, yes, it's a substantive theory, but I think he gives it less weight in the Nicomachean Ethics than he does in the Eudemian, that there's a line there that if you look at it seems to be less central. I think it's more, honestly, a way of thinking about the relationship between the different vices and the virtues and recognizing that there is this structure. How much work it's really going to do for you. I don't think he's offering it as a decision procedure for sure. I think it's an interesting observation about the way that the virtues and vices tend to cluster, but perhaps he's less enthused by it than he was initially.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll put Lucas on now. He has some questions too.
Cool.
Hi. Well, my question is just a small question about thesis. So, as I was saying to Daniel and Marta in the backstage, I don't have any horses in this race. I come from a different environment. But I want to be sure that I got you right when you're talking about and rejecting this Archimedean way of taking the nature as something outside the domain. So I'm always very, very dissatisfied with what people normally say about nature in Aristotelian texts, because sometimes they don't get the point, because they think, well, this is nature in the way we use it, etc. And I think that most occurrences, thesis in Aristotle just means the way in which something develops and the way in which something just arrives at given, sometimes concrete structure. For instance, in the biological writings, it's very common to find nature being used in this way.
Yeah.
But I'm specifically wondering about two occurrences in the Nicomachean Ethics that someone opposing your view might point to. But I'm sympathetic to your view. Actually, I'm just playing the devil's advocate to raise those questions. So one question is in the methodological passage right in the beginning, chapter 3, when Aristotle has this pragmatos thesis, and people normally have some funny views about it, but I take that expression just to point to what the pragma is as something that I mean, my claim goes in the direction of your formal claim, because what is the pragma there is not the whole subject matter, but it's the specific thing you are dealing with in that specific question you are raising. For instance, you're talking about action. Let's just try to see what action is. So pragma would be that thing you are interested in, not the whole domain of ethics or whatever, practical philosophy, and this sort of thing. And the other occurrence of thesis, I'm interested in here what you have to say is, I think it's well, I have the Nicomachean Ethics here, but I think generally we remember that in the beginning of book 3, discussing the voluntary, there is some reference. I think there is not more than a reference. I think that the expression anthropine thesis occurs there. So that's human nature. But one way of taking that expression is very deflationary, just as pointing to maybe in the way that Greek medicine will take the word as human constitution, in the way that medicine takes constitution. So it's the concrete structure of our body, of our life, our body, which does not support some sort of situations we might be put in, like torture, etc., etc. So that has nothing to do with, let's just say, human nature with capitals, as people sometimes used to think, but it has to do more with these concrete limits of the human bodily constitution. So this is the question.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think you're pointing to something important, which is that I'm both toggling to and fro between a modern and ancient notions of nature, but then also there's questions about the many different things that Aristotle does with physis. So yeah, it's the reason why I come in with this question about Aristotle's appeal to human nature is because that's been the argument made in the literature, and I gather among people who are teaching Aristotle as sort of not necessarily from the ancient philosophy point of view, but teaching him as a contemporary contender in sort of metaethics. That's not an uncommon view, possibly supported by a certain kind of reading of Anscombe Foote, which I think is wrong. I don't think Foote is reading Aristotle as Williams does, but she's sometimes taken to be doing that. So what I'd like to do is consider the question seriously whether Aristotle could be an Archimedean naturalist, right? Whether he could be appealing to human nature. And it's a bit tricky because Aristotle's notion of nature is, within a metaphysical context, I think is ultimately normative. I think you can't completely ever separate Aristotle's physis from the natural norms that are partly coming out of his metaphysics, right? That there's a directionality to everything becoming like God, that things are, the universe is structured in a certain sort of way. But I think you can nonetheless define something like a notion of human nature that you could investigate in Aristotle, in his biology, right? He gives you the resources for thinking about the kind of view that Williams wants to attribute to him. And I just set it up in order to say, this is why I don't think that's true of the ethics. I think there may be as I said, in Politics 1, there's a lot of appeal to physis to make substantive ethical decisions, normative decisions. But I don't think it's the view that the kind of physis that he's developing in his biology, where you actually are investigating from this semi-observer sort of point of view. And I think you're right too, that there's a softer notion of physis where it really just means something like, it isn't biologically grounded, as it were. And people have argued that, I think Annas has particularly done this, looked at the way that he uses physis in the normative treatises. I think maybe Kraut too is on board with this and says it's just systematically different. Here's some of the differences, and that's great. I mean, that I'm sort of on board with that. But I'm more interested in showing that the apparent appeals to the way we are, like the function arguments, aren't really doing that kind of work. So, there's a project where you're tracking the actual uses of physis in the normative work and saying, well, what sort of notion is this? And that's hard because you're always doing it in the context of certain assumptions about what the project is. So I haven't been working at that level with physis just because it's such a slippery term, as you say. I've more been looking at the kind of conceptual framework that we've been reading the ethics through and saying, you know, here's why, if you want to read it that way, there are some things you could pick up on. You know, that he does say something about natural justice, but, you know, that's not really real justice. Justice, when it comes down to it, is a different sort of, has a different kind of grounding. So I think you really have to settle the question not at the textual level, but at the metatextual level, because it's so slippery. There's so many different ways you can read what's going on in the ethics, and he's not always you know, that easy to get the clear picture on what the metaethics is. Yeah, so thanks for that.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. So I'll take advantage of the time and space that we have to try understand the discussion better. So I'm not a specialist at all in the area, and as you will probably see, I have a very superficial understanding of some of the issues. But nonetheless, I'm curious because I think that my superficial understanding of various aspects of Aristotle ethics, it's probably it fits very well with this label of naturalism, and probably with this Archimedean naturalism. So I'll try to describe why I think that this view seems convincing. And my curiosity is, can you tell me from the constructivist point of view where it got wrong, this type of reasoning? So my understanding, so I would say that this naturalism is an Aristotelian idea, because we have these arguments. For example, there is the function argument, there is the distinction between intellectual and virtues of the intellectual part of the soul and virtues associated with the non-intellectual part of the soul. There is all this talking about the fact that there is a relationship, and sort of hierarchical relationship between the two. And it seems to me, or again, my superficial understanding of the things is that even the distinction between the various virtues of character is based on what are, for Aristotle, emotions that are related to basic life functions. So it seems to me that he's in the background is constantly looking at this thing that for us is a thing that is human soul, basically, the way it is structured, what are the basic life functions. And again, it seems to me that it's always referring to this to describe what are virtues, what are the different types of virtues, how they are related, and so on. And since, as I said, this human soul seems to be something very concrete, and it's the object of natural science, it's the object of psychology or biology, whatever we want to call, from Aristotelian point of view, this thing. It seems sufficient to say, yes, it's a sort of naturalistic position, and it's probably a sort of Archimedean naturalistic position. So where exactly this starts to be a distortion of Aristotle's view from the point of view of your interpretation, of a constructivist interpretation? This, I understand, is more like, probably it's useful to me because of my superficial understanding, but maybe it can be useful for someone in the audience as well that has the same superficial level of understanding of the issue.
Thank you. No, I don't think it's superficial. I think it's
good.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very common reading of Aristotle. It does have some support in the text. Marissa Lunason has recently written a book particularly tracing the way that virtues and emotions, life functions, as you said, tie together, and also that there's some continuities between the way he talks about temperament in Aristotle and temperament in human beings. And she pulled together all the evidence for the kind of reading that you're suggesting. And you know, when you look at it, you think, wow, that's a lot. There's a compelling case there. And I think there's a reason why people have tended to read him in the way that Williams suggests right there, that he's doing this kind of Archimedean project. It's when you start pressing on some of the things he says at the more structural level about, yeah, these things, there is human nature, right? And that affects who we are as ethical beings. There's some continuities between the temperaments and the virtues, for sure. But the temperaments are not virtues. Being warm-hearted is not the same as being generous. It's doing it as the good person should, for the reasons at the time and the place, whatever. It's not coming out of some sort of natural tendency. Those tendencies may help you. He's all on board with that, but it's actually taking on board the role of practical reason to do the work of deciding not only how and when and where, whatever, but which virtue is the one to take on board. So if you're simply think about training children, right? You tend to train them for a single temperament at a time. You're either training them to be courageous or you're training them to be generous. What that doesn't do is give them the experience in deciding when it's a case for one versus the other. And if you're simply doing that kind of temperament training, that's what the Spartans do, right? They're very good at training their young men to be bold and to rush in and all that. And it's better. They're more effective fighters, but they don't have the practical reasoning that's required for true courage. They're bold. And these are different. So absolutely, there's a continuity, but there's a break. And the break is where practical reason comes in. So you can stress the continuities, but then you're missing the piece that actually matters, which is what makes a difference between true courage and the sort of thing that animals do. And Aristotle's a great ethologist. He looks at those continuities. But again, back to the debate about with Marta about the Neurathian piece. They may come from our biological heritage. He knows that never goes away, right? You still have to feed the kids and defend the city and all that kind of stuff. But you're debating rationally about how you think it's best to do that. And that's not about how best to realize your nature. It's about how to find what's truly fine, what's truly admirable here. And it's that change of subject. McDowell actually explains it rather well in the passage that Marta was referring to about the wolf, right? So imagine a wolf who did have practical reasoning. The wolf could step back from wolf nature and say, wow, am I going to do that or not? And that wolf is no longer a natural wolf, right? That wolf is no longer, even if a lot of its behavior does happen to accord with nature, if you can stop and reflect, you're taking responsibility for endorsing. You're making the ethical decisions there, even if the decision is to, just run with the pack. And that's the difference. That's the critical thing that takes you out of the natural realm. It is a break. It's a metaphysical transubstantiation, if in Guise's term. I'm calling it using slightly different language. So the function argument, let's go to the function argument. And I think this is really important because it looks like, okay, Aristotle's trying to solve a problem here about why this life, the life of reason, rather than the life of pleasure or the life of honor, is going to be the right one. And yeah, he's going to appeal to the kind of being that we are. He appeals to a few other things too. He appeals to the self-sufficiency. He appeals to the notion of what's more perfect, what's more complete, and in the end, to what's more blessed. So it's only one of several criteria, and it doesn't in the end give you enough content to decide how to live. Notoriously, people are still debating, does that mean I should be using reason in the virtuous life, or does it mean, you know, in the practical sphere, or does it mean I should be doing ivory tower contemplation for Aristotle? And yeah, the fact that we're committed to reasoning as part of what it means to be human is a part of the story. But the thing about reasoning is it's got its own goals. Reasoning isn't referring to human nature necessarily. It's not constrained to do that. It can pick its own goals. So you're in a different sphere here when you're saying, okay, reason is our nature, but reason, when you're reasoning, you're in the space of practical reasoning, if you like. You're not constrained by nature. You might decide to endorse your nature, or you might not, and you have that option. So we're in a different world here. Reason is no longer decisive. The intellectual character virtues, I don't think that really speaks to the question, because I think, again, you've got both practical reasoning and theoretical reasoning. It does tell us something about the sort of being we are by, you know, you can generalize over that, but it doesn't settle the question about how to live. You've got to settle that by reasoning with other practical reasoners. And that's the thing that I think makes that critical difference. Is that helping at all, or you want to?
Yeah, but my maybe another curiosity that I have, how much of this is due to a difference between what we would call nature or biological nature of animals and human beings, qua animals, and what Aristotle would call human nature? I mean, all this description about the space of reasons and so on, while you were describing this and McDowell example of the wolf and so on, yeah, I was thinking, yeah, but that's exactly the point for Aristotle. This is human nature. Like humans are animals that have access to this space of reason. So from an Aristotelian point of view, this is naturalism when we are talking about humans. But I understand that in it's not the first thing someone would think about today if we are talking about ethical position based on the understanding of what is human nature from a biological point of view. I see that. I say that. So I mean, if I reformulate this as okay, what Aristotle thinks is being naturalist about humans is what today is called constructivism. Would that be a good way of formulating the thing, or we are still missing something whenever we talk about naturalism, even from trying to put ourselves from the perspective of Aristotle when he is talking about what is human nature?
Right. Yeah. So the question whether we're just really arguing about terms here, is it what McDowell calls second nature? Is that what I'm calling constructivism? I think it's actually a bit more specific. I think you get more content when you're using the notion of constructivism. It's not just simply that we're using the terms differently. It's about where's the substantive advice and where does the justification come from? And if you think about the idea, well, look, these questions come apart in ethics. If we think that what we're doing when we're reasoning practically is we're looking at a number of different constraints, a number of different possible options, and we can get our criteria for what counts as good living from a number of different sources, one of which may be our human nature. But the point is that reason, practical reason, is making the decision about how much weight to give those and why. So that's the thing that makes a substantive difference. I think when it comes to reading Aristotle as a constructivist, there's some very specific work that you get out of the constructivist reading, which is that it's the sense in which action is aiming at some good, that's doing some justificatory work here, and it's sort of giving you the sources of normativity. So I think it does matter to think about it as constructivist rather than simply as saying, well, that's really what McDowell or Owen mean by second nature. Yeah, I guess I'm resisting the attempt to sort of assimilate them.
That's the last one. So it's just for me to understand better what is at stake when we are talking about constructivism. Does it make sense from a constructivist point of view to say something like there are occasions where rational agents decide to act for moral reasons, to act against their own nature? Does it make sense to say that from a constructivist point of view?
Yeah, I think that would be right. Yeah, I mean, for instance, this is a sort of thing that Annis is considering in her discussion with Hursthouse. So proposals about collective child raising that were tried in some cultures. If it turns out that human beings aren't really very comfortable with that because they have this sort of natural affinity with their own children, and they decide not to pursue those, it's, in a way, you might say, well, that's nature triumphing, but actually it isn't. It's reason, it's practical reasoning, right? They could have continued to do things against their own impulses or their own unhappiness. They're making a reasoned choice there based on values. We decide to modify a bunch of stuff about our human nature, right? It may turn out that enslaving other humans is a robust fact of our anthropological ancestry. You know, we're not going there. That's something we've decided is not the way we want to live, and we can do that. So yeah, I think we can.
I see. I think now I see more clearly what is really at stake in saying constructivist or naturalist, even from a Aristotelian, let's say, point of view, naturalist. I see. Thank you. For me, it helps a lot.
Good, thanks.
Okay, so we have no further questions from the audience. I've asked them, they didn't put up any. I will ask the debaters if they have any more questions. Marta said she did, but then I think she got satisfied with the way things went with Roberto. Is that right, Marta?
Yeah, I thought Roberto's questions were great. It is I think that maybe an extra follow-up could be to just ask about how compatible you think that the view that you're defending is with the kinds of things that you found in Mariska Loinissen's book. So that, and that's where I was just trying to kind of open some intermediate space in which we don't go all the way to constructivism, but we don't do an Archimedean naturalism, but we have some kind of other sort of naturalism that is compatible with saying the kinds of things that Mariska is just kind of displaying in that book. That it's a lot of material, and a lot of it is of the kind that seems like nature is setting a lot of limits, and there's some kind of ideals that nature is giving to us. And in that regard, maybe just even if it is constructivism, it will be a special kind of constructivism that is limited by nature in a kind of radical way.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think in the end, though, the difference, but you've got to think about the difference between temperament and character, right? Which is Aristotle knows that some people are just naturally bolder, some people are naturally warmer and fuzzier, and that's great, but it's not true generosity, it's not true courage. It's about doing it on the basis of practical wisdom, as the good person would. And that's the difference. There's this break between the temperament and true virtue. And it's about the thing that we do, and it's got to be a continuity, right? Because small children are more like animals, but there is this special thing when it comes to action, and it's this deliberating about what's best, and that's the difference that makes all the difference. So yeah, I think she collected a fabulous amount of evidence. It's wonderful material.
Yeah, like I think what the kind of thing you're saying is not incompatible with that, in the sense that like human nature for Aristotle is an achievement in the end. So like we do get to be like a good specimen of what it is to be a human. And of course, for that, we do need to do this work. So it's just like what you're saying, that McDowell calls second nature. So there is a lot of habituation that gets into achieving human nature, in the sense that if we just follow our impulses, we might not there's work that has to be done. That doesn't mean that what we achieve when we get to the end of that achievement, we shouldn't be calling human nature in his view. So if human nature is an achievement, then that looks like it's kind of like a little bit of that probably you don't want to accept, because that would be just like a version of naturalism. But it's a naturalism in which the nature is not given. So it's not Archimedean in the sense that nature can be used as a kind of like a starting point of what ethics is. It's just like the nature is something that is achieved, and it might be achieved in an Eurasian way, and it's not something that like comes in the natural books. Nonetheless, whatever we say in the biological books is going to set up limits to like how we get there, the tools that we have given naturally to get there, but also the kind of like the things that we can kind of set out to ourselves as goals get limited by that. I'm just going to not keep saying because I know that we're close to the end, but I just wanted to clarify that it's not like that shouldn't be incompatible from the way in which I'm looking at it.
I think there are real differences, because you can't habituate into practical wisdom, right? You can habituate into temperament, you can habituate to boldness, but not to courage. You've got to do the reasoning part, and he says at one point that human beings are so much worse than animals. We're so much more potential to be evil because of all the different ways that we can go. There are discontinuities, even while there are some continuities, and it's the reasoning part, right? The fact that we, as you said, with as McDowell elegantly points out with the wolf, we can step back and ask. And that makes us responsible in a different way than the animals are. And that puts us in a different conversation. There's no ethics in the animal world. It's the human world we're talking about here. It's a jump start, right? You do something really different there. And you've got a new kind of normativity, and it's practical normativity, and we need to talk about that. And it doesn't come from nature. We got, considerations that come from nature, but we're deciding how to weigh those against other ones.
Okay.
Lucas, Roberto, any follow-ups? No? Well, thank you, everybody, especially Sylvia. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Sylvia. We hope to have you here again to talk more about Aristotle, whether it's his ethics, his metaethics, or any other subject. Thank you all for coming, Roberto, Lucas, and Marta, and everybody who has been watching so far. Our next lecture will be in 3 weeks, I think. The next lecturer, this I'm positive, is Professor Mariska Leonison, precisely the one we'll be talking about now. She hasn't given me her title yet, but as soon as she does, I'll forward it to all of you. And after Mariska, the last conference we have this year is Professor Julius Persson. I'm not sure if we're going to have any more. Maybe we'll stop there and begin again next year. Thank you all, everybody. Bye-bye. See you all in 3 weeks.
Thank you. See you.